This is the talk about there is no I in DevOps. With us today is Bart Driscoll. Bart Driscoll comes to us by way of Dell EMC, where he's the director for the global services group within Dell EMC. I'm sorry, I almost said EMC. He has spent the last 20 years honing his development and delivery skills in roles such as information architect, release manager, test manager, agile coach, architect, and as a program manager. So please give a welcome to Bart Driscoll. And by the way, please hold your questions until the end, and we'll make sure that we have time for a couple questions. So thank you, and welcome, Bart.
So with that intro, I don't really have a lot I have to say. I guess what I will say is I actually came to DevOps almost by accident. As you heard, I was an Agile coach for a while. And what I found is I was going around and coaching and telling all of these teams that every 2 weeks they needed to release into production. But guess what? That's really hard to do, especially when you don't have any systems or automation, or frankly, if you're even talking to the ops and infrastructure teams. And so I realized rather than going around and continuing to be a hypocrite, I would go try to fix the problem. And that's kind of how I ended up in this DevOps space. So we're all here today to not talk about Windows, and I realize this is the Windows room. So if you're looking for that, sorry. We're here to talk about culture and some of the challenges with culture and DevOps. So when you leave here today, the one thing that I want you to really believe and walk away with is that introducing DevOps and changing culture in your enterprise is possible. It's definitely not easy. There is absolutely no magic to kind of just make it happen. And more often than not, it really hurts. Sorry. But there are a couple things that we can do to help make it hurt a little bit less, maybe even give you the illusion of magic. And make it a little bit easier. And those three keys are measure, radiate, and evolve. So the first is measure, right? I know nobody likes to measure. Frankly, I don't really like to measure. But without doing it, we can't capture the data that we need to determine if what we're doing when we introduce automation or collaboration is actually working or not. I used to have an old boss, and he kind of took me aside one day and said, look, if someone is going to accuse you of being successful, how do you prove it, right? Changing the culture to more of a DevOps focus is really hard, right? Make sure the numbers and the data are on your side. The second is radiate. Whenever I hear radiate, for some reason, I always think zombie apocalypse, right? And you need to start small, right? You infect a small group of people, and then that virus matures a little bit, and then all of a sudden, it's multiplying exponentially across your enterprise. And so the third key is evolve, right? Change takes time. It happens iteratively. So be patient. So before jumping into the three keys, I just want to talk a little bit about why most DevOps projects fail. Interestingly enough, as I was coming over here, we were sitting at a table over in where all the booths are, and a guy sat down, and he was just like, oh, this DevOps stuff. And so we had a kind of interesting conversation. But anyways, so DevOps normally starts with somebody like you, right? You read the latest Puppet survey, you may have picked up a book or two, a blog, downloaded some tools, and you start tinkering. And as you're tinkering, you start to think. And your thinking is, hey, I want my enterprise to be more like what I'm reading about. And I think we can do it. We just need to automate this, change a couple things here, and maybe get so-and-so to agree, right? Pretty easy. So you grab your hero's cape, and you go and you start your crusade. If you're lucky or persuasive, you're able to get a couple people to join you in your quest. You build a prototype. It's really cool. It has all this great automation, some interesting bells, whistles, and instrumentation. You're really psyched. You show it to your boss. He says, yeah, this is great. You do a brown bag. Maybe you even come to a conference and present. Right? You're kings. You're flying high, or queens. But then what happens is you go and talk to a product development team, and you try to get that product development team to start using your prototype. And rather than being carried through the enterprise, being showered with lavish gifts, you were confronted with a wall of constraints and objections. Things like, this is never going to work. we already tried this. Why should I change? Where's the ROI? So, faced with this wall of inertia, in about 6 months, all of that great work that you did to build out the prototype has now kind of died. And you're walking around and you're depressed, moving through the day-to-day, or frustrated and maybe even looking for a new job. And you're kind of asking yourself, why? Why did this fail? Did I pick the wrong tools? Why didn't people adopt it, right? What did I do wrong? So that wall of inertia, right, all those complaints, those objections, change experts call that the valley of despair. And all change efforts, in fact, all learning, goes through the valley of despair. Right? It is where all of that cool hype that you created building your early prototype needs to transition into normal and boring and routine. I liken this whole process actually to learning how to ride a bike. So, think back to when you were a kid, assuming that's when you learned how to ride a bike. You're sitting on the top of that hill, hopefully a little one. Training wheels are off, you get the wind in your face, you're psyched. You got your family or your friends, and they're kind of cheering you on. And you start rolling, and you're like, I'm riding. This is awesome. And then a couple seconds later, you start to wobble a little bit. And all of a sudden, you crash. You get up and you start yelling at your bike. You get really mad at your parents for making you even try to ride the bike, and you swear there's no way in hell I am getting back on that bike. You're in the valley of despair. I realize it's over there, sorry. You know that if you don't get back on that bike, you're never going to learn how to ride. It's the same as DevOps transformation and changing your culture, right? It takes a lot of perseverance and courage to get back on that bike and keep trying, just like changing your culture with DevOps. So, when you're a kid and you fall off your bike, you can usually be convinced with just ice cream to get back on the bike again, right? But at work, dealing with all of the people you need to deal with, it tends to take a little bit more, right? And so for us, what we've been learning is that there are really 3 keys: measure, radiate, and evolve, that can help with that transformation. So before getting into a little bit more detail around the specifics of those 3 keys and some of the examples that we have with that, I want to unpack culture a little bit, right? Because it's what we're trying to change, so let's better understand it. So like riding a bike, culture is all of the things that you do without thinking about it, right? It isn't until you can pedal and steer and balance that you really start to enjoy, riding a bike, that you have kind of embraced the culture of riding a bike. So culture is that collection of beliefs and behaviors and values and symbols that are shared through stories and imitation. Culture is not something that you're going to find in an organizational chart. It's not something you're going to find in process documentation, right? It isn't written down. It's the underlying undocumented operating fabric of an organization. So, think back to when you started, your first month at a new job at a new company, right? How many times did you hear, blah, 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 because that's the way we do it? Or blah, 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 hey, go talk to Mary because she's the only one that knows how to do it and she can show you, right? That's culture. It's that underlying undocumented fabric. Yeah, but it's like, so why is it so dang hard to change? So I liken culture to a knit sweater, right? You can push, you can pull, you can tug, you can stretch a sweater, but for the most part, it always bounces back to its original shape, just like culture. It's very resilient. It isn't until you start to unravel that sweater and start to reshape it into a new sweater that you're actually starting to change your culture. At first, this is a really, really slow, hard process. Over time, as more people start using the new way, you start to gain a little bit of momentum and acceleration. As more people move to the model, ultimately you really can accelerate and start transforming the whole organization. In order to get that acceleration, you need a very deliberate, intentional process that involves measuring your results, radiating your successes, and ultimately evolving the organization over time. So let's start by talking about measuring. Measuring is really critical. It is how you can illustrate and prove that you're being successful. A nice case study that we like to talk about a lot, well, I guess an example would be, we come into an organization and we start helping them talk about DevOps, and we find out that it's taking them 45 days. 45 days is their mean time to deploy. And so after we do a little bit of work with them, we're able to shift that to, say, 15 days mean time to deploy. Right? By having that baseline and by having that new set of metrics, I'm now able to go back to the stakeholders and the sponsors and say, hey, look, we have a 300% improvement in performance. Right? We just got time, we just got funding. What better way to demonstrate our ROI than to be showing them metrics that are hard data, right? Metrics are the language of that executive. This is actually my most favorite. This is some work that we did with a title insurance company that's actually not that far from here. And when we came in and started working with them, we focused on one single application. That application had 4 releases per year. That's really what the business decided was what they wanted to do. And on average, every time they tried to release a new version of this application, they encountered 98 defects related to deployment and configuration. Like, this isn't functional. This isn't anything to do with the features in the application. This is purely getting that new version running in production. And we found, based on the remedy data, that it was taking on average 33 hours to fix these problems. So doing some pretty simple math, 4 releases, 98 defects, 38 hours, right? It was taking them 6.5 people years to release this application 4 times a year. And using simple math, that much time times about $75 an hour, it was costing them $1 million to support deploying this application. So we work with them to introduce some automation and some configuration using tools like Puppet. And by simply bringing the development team and the operations team together and having them collaborate on building out these automation and configuration scripts, we were able to reduce the number of defects from 98 to 2. So the business still wants to do 4 releases a year. They didn't really want to go faster. That wasn't what it was all about. And we weren't there long enough to figure out if what the work that we did impacted how long it took, so we just kept the number the same. But as you can very clearly see here, we went from almost 13,000 hours to less than 250 hours. That's like a month and a half of one person's time, right? $1 million to less than $20,000. With numbers like this, you go to your boss, you're going to get the support, you're going to get the funding, you might even get a raise, right, for doing this type of work. So the other thing that I really like about metrics is that they're really easy to share in reports and dashboards and posters, et cetera. We all know that success breeds success. So when we're able to make them more visible, it's easier for us to start building mind share within the organization. Everybody wants to be on the winning team. So the more that you can demonstrate that you are the winning team, the more likely people will come to you. So what do we measure? If not measuring server configs, what, right? So it's going to be a little bit different for every organization, but the process of defining your metrics is really going to be the same. It always starts top down, right? We want to make sure that every metric that we're creating is aligned with the overarching enterprise and corporate goals, right? That's where the company's going to spend money. If you can't align to them, it's going to be really hard for you to get the funding and the support from managers, senior leaders, and executives to do your transformation. Oftentimes what we'll see is that a lot of those enterprise goals end up getting distilled by IT into goals such as drive performance and efficiency, or reduce cost, or improve time to market, or improve quality, right? So those are all really great ideas, and directionally they're correct, but they're really just not actionable. So when we start talking about metrics, we want to make sure that they're all actionable. In other words, we want to be able to define very specific, measurable targets and then understand what processes and practices are going to be affected by those targets, so that we can get a more holistic picture around what's going to need to change in order to achieve those targets. So what we're looking at right here, this is called an X-type chart, or an X chart. And what I really like about this particular tool is that it makes it really easy to communicate your metrics to leaders and executives, because it maps your specific targets to the affected processes, to the annual IT goals around this left-hand side, and then it can actually map it all the way back to the enterprise objectives. So in one single page, you're able to now very easily communicate and show the mapping between your annual improvement targets and how those are going to drive enterprise goals. It makes what you're doing incredibly transparent. So, specifically, that X-type chart actually came from a large global bank that we were working with. And one of their specific improvement targets was, by the end of 2016, they wanted to be able to shift from a 90-day release cycle to a 28-day release cycle. And so, when we did that mapping, we started taking a look at, okay, if we want to change how quickly we can deploy, what processes and practices are going to have to change? So we came up with kind of a quick list, right? Well, how we develop and deliver software, well, that's going to have to change. How we deploy it, that's probably going to have to change too, or at least be impacted. How we do release management, how we handle the database and the lifecycle associated with the database, how we get infrastructure, how the platform works, and then ultimately how we do application architecture, the governance aspects of releasing an application. And then what we did is we started looking at what are some of the specific behaviors and practices that happen at the team level, right? Because we know that we're going to want to start changing individual behaviors in order to achieve those improvement targets. So for example, one of the things that we recommended is start looking at code commits, for example. If you're not committing code frequently and your merge processes are taking a really long time when you do commit code, you're never going to be able to deploy in 28 days. So while frequent code commits aren't specifically going to enable you to develop in 28 days, they're absolutely one of those key behaviors that you want to start introducing to your development and test teams really early in order to be able to achieve that goal. Now, one of the things that we need to take into consideration is that it takes a long time to change behaviors. On average, it takes 3 to 6 weeks to create a single habit. And that's making the assumption that over that 3 to 6 week period, you're practicing a lot and you're checking that you're doing it a lot. So be patient when you're trying to change behaviors on teams. So in working with a lot of customers around helping them to define metrics, because it is one of the things we try to do really early in the process, make sure that you have the data in order to create those metrics, right? If it's going to go take you 2 months to go get the piece of data, it's probably not going to be worth it at this point, right? Work with what you have. Make sure that your metrics are measuring the desired outcome, right? Look at those affected processes. Are the metrics trying to measure a specific behavioral change in one of those? And then how is that going to specifically drive the target? It's really important to make sure that there's all this alignment in there. Once you have established a new behavior, like more frequent code commits, you can get rid of the metric and add a new one, like maybe automated unit testing for infrastructure, for example. Make a big deal of achieving and beating your metrics, right? Go buy your team ice cream. It's pretty easy to do. So we've covered measure. Let's take a quick look at radiate. So radiation is a really different approach to organizational change. While the outcomes are the same, right, a new operating fabric, so to speak, how you get there is really different. The traditional distribute and inspect model is what most of us are really familiar with. It's more, let's define our structure, let's define our processes, let's define our tools and all that great stuff up front, and then we're going to roll it out to the teams. And then we're going to have some centralized inspection practices like CABs and ARBs, to make sure that we're following the new model. The other thing with this distributed inspect model is that it makes the assumption that you have most of the answers up front and that you're only going to make minor tweaks as you start rolling it out across your organization. So DevOps takes a really different approach. Right? This prove and radiate strategy is a much, much more organic approach to organizational change. It really starts by changing those individual behaviors, like code commits, and then using those individual behavioral changes to start changing the way that people think and their attitudes towards work. Really what we're trying to do with this model is create new experiences and stories around how work gets done, and then using those new stories and experiences to ultimately change culture. I think the other big thing with the prove and radiate strategy is DevOps doesn't believe to have the answers up front. There are definitely some patterns, there are definitely some models and even approaches, but in the end, it really believes that the process of transforming, you need to learn and adapt throughout the entire process. So it all starts with one team, and it's a very decentralized model where we want to make sure that the people solving the problems are the ones that are close to it, right, that have the most information about it. They're going to go and build an end-to-end pipeline for a single app or a single component. Right? They're going to build automation and orchestrate the pipeline, and they're going to include a lot of the common sticking points like regression testing or provisioning infrastructure or security scans. And as part of that process and as part of building that out, they're going to actually be able to start capturing data around how effective is my pipeline process? Where are those common sticking points? Like, where should I go focus my energy and efforts next? Another thing that happens during this pilot process is you start creating internal champions. If you remember in the keynote, Ms. Davis from Pivotal was talking about how important it is to recognize and create those champions in your organization, right? Because they're ultimately the ones that are going to lead transformation moving forward. Oftentimes you do have to bring in some external coaches to kind of help create and develop these champions and subject matter experts. Those external coaches are able to pair with these folks and help product teams adopt and adapt the new systems. But in the end, it's those internal champions that are going to help you navigate the political and organizational structure of the organization. They're going to be the ones that help decide when and how hard to push. Right? They are the real leaders of the change. The technical subject matter experts that we want to be developing as part of this process are the ones that are really going to lend credibility to the solution. When it comes down to it, they're going to be the ones that are working hands-on with the product teams to adopt and adapt the systems, right? They're the ones that are going to be proving and implementing this new operating fabric. So, as this team is working and they're building out the model, they're starting to collect metrics to determine how successful they're being. Those champions are going to start sharing that success across the organization. And subject matter experts are going to start extending the platform and tools that you built. The new operating fabric is going to begin to emerge from the success stories from these various teams that are starting to use the new model. You're going to start accelerating how quickly new teams are moving over to this new model based on that success, ultimately replacing the old operating fabric. And the old operating fabric that may remain with a minimal footprint, but the intent obviously is to remove it entirely. So that entire process that I just kind of mapped out there is what a lot of people are calling bimodal IT, right? It's how do I kind of run these two different operating models in parallel. But I truly believe that the end state is to actually be running a single mode of IT, and that's being this new model. So one of the key things around radiation that makes it successful is starting with the right team. In fact, this is probably the most important thing with the radiation aspect. That bank that I was talking about a little bit earlier, they really learned the hard way about selecting the right team. So the first time that they tried doing DevOps, they created a team, they built a tool chain, they even generated a little bit of excitement about it. But it wasn't too long into the process when they started trying to get a product team to use it that they ended up crashing. So they didn't have support from the technical leaders. They didn't have support from the middle managers, and they didn't have executive support to introduce all of this change. And so as a result, they failed. So when you're building this team, make sure that you're getting the people that are both excited and committed to change, but make sure that they're also a cross-functional team that has the ability to challenge the status quo. Right? We're going to need people from multiple levels of the organization and across the different disciplines of the organization. So this radiation strategy is a pretty difficult strategy to use. There's a book called The Knowing Doing Gap by Pfeiffer and Sutton. I highly recommend it. I tend to use a lot of these strategies when working with customers. These are kind of my cliff notes for it. Right? The first is be clear about why. Right? If you can't communicate why you're trying to change something, you really can't expect anybody to follow you. Do more and teach more. I've heard this a number of times through about a number of sessions today. Right? We learn by doing, particularly as adult learners. And we really gain mastery when we start teaching others, because that's when we're able to take the knowledge that we learned from doing, invest in someone else, and begin to apply these practices. Expect failure and drive out fear. Right? You are going to fail. You are going to write code that you have to throw away. That doesn't mean it isn't valuable. Right? Learn from your mistakes. Try not to do them again. Collaborate and listen more. Compete less. So we hear a lot about internal competition, particularly when we're working with pretty large organizations. And internal competition is great when you're trying to figure out what product strategy is the right direction to go, or how are customers going to use a different product. But when it comes to cross-department competition, we find that all that really does is creates bigger silos, more handoffs, and inefficient processes that ultimately just waste time and money. So try to collaborate more and try to compete less with your peers in different groups. And lastly, measure outcomes. So it's not just me that says you should measure. It is really important in the process. All right, lastly is around evolve. So the most common mistake that we see when customers try to embrace DevOps is they really just end up recreating exactly what they're doing today with maybe just a little bit more automation and a handful of people with DevOps in their title. I was at OpenStack Summit, and I kind of stole this example because it's a great one, right? This is a company that took a look at their internal processes. It took them 44 days to release software. They knew it was too long. They needed to go faster. They made a very sizable investment in cloud technologies and automation. Spent a whole bunch of time and energy building out that automation. Anybody have any idea what they were able to shift their 44 days to? 43. That's pretty dang close, actually. 42, right? This isn't the results that they were looking for. Right? If you don't enable your teams to challenge the status quo, to start making changes to your processes, you're not going to be successful. You're going to get stuck with Conway's Law, and you're just going to continue to repeat the mistakes of the past. The best approach to unwinding that is to iterate. We've all heard the DevOps mantra, right, of start small, build, learn, measure, right? It's not new. I mean, that's basic scientific method applied to IT and software development. It is the way that we introduce innovations and figure out, what works and what doesn't work. So this is absolutely the strategy for transformation. But how do you make sure that you're on the right path? Like, how do you even start going down the right path? Well, for starters, we want to make sure that we're going to be modeling this system holistically. One of the first things that we do with every single customer that we work with is have them do a value stream map. It's a very simple process of simply mapping out what does it take to go from concept to working software in production, or concept to cash, right? And we find that even really simple things like deploying a change into production requires developers, testers, DBAs, project managers, release managers, security, operations, infrastructure, et cetera. Worst one we've seen has been 27 different groups. It is really important to get the perspective and expertise of all of those key groups when you're designing your new system, right? Because they're all responsible for key steps and attributes moving along that pathway. The second thing is to create pipelines or create tool chains that are actually designed to change, right? We have a whole bunch of different technology stacks and different types of applications in our portfolio. We need to make sure that the tool chains and the processes that we're building are able to be flexible enough to adapt to those different types of tools. You know, a really great example is in the dev stage, you have to build and compile code, right? If you're running a Java application, you're probably going to use Jenkins or Maven. If you're running a .NET application, you're probably going to use MS Build, right? Both tools are good. Both tools work, right? Forcing your developers to pick a tool may actually impede performance and start to create resentment, both of which are really bad for adoption, as you can imagine, right? The whole point is, how do we start to build a platform and a set of services that make it easier for our product development teams to move change, to be successful in introducing change, but as importantly, to be compliant in how they're sending out that change. You know, if we're not able to create a platform and a system that enables them to do that, they're going to work around us. That's shadow IT. We've all heard it. So the third thing that we need to remember is around thinking in layers, right? When we're dealing with really complex problems like security or compliance or things like that, we don't want to start by designing for the whole enterprise. We want to start with a single application. As we onboard new and more applications onto this new operating model, patterns are going to emerge. You know, maybe it's the archetype of the application. Maybe it's the technology stack. Maybe it's the line of business or the types of services that it supports. When we start to see those patterns, those are the patterns that we want to start promoting up the policy stack so that we can maximize the reuse of test cases and frameworks that we've been developing. And the last thing that we want to take into consideration is when we scale, we want to follow the dependency paths of applications. So kind of going back to that bank example, right? When they started their pilot, they did it originally for a Microsoft CRM application, for a MuleSoft integration layer, and for the SQL database, right? So those are all circled in red on the picture here. And you know, the next logical step for them was to take a look at, well, you know, what other applications are connected to these pieces, and you know, let's start to build the automation to support those as well, because we ended up what we're finding is when you follow that dependency path, you get a lot more reuse, because the software development life cycles tend to be the same. A lot of the governance and policy requirements tend to be the same. And it's not uncommon that the actual technology stacks tend to be the same, because you're usually dealing with the same architecture teams. So when we think about how to evolve within an organization, right, it's not about big bang. It's iterate, iterate, iterate. That's really hard, actually, for a lot of enterprises to embrace. It's really different from how we've done it in the past. Be holistic in the design, right? You need to get all of those stakeholders in the room to help you design this new system. You can't do it in isolation. Use API-driven architectures, right? We want to be able to have one workflow, wrap that workflow with an API layer, and hang multiple tools off of it to be able to support different types of applications. When we're defining those policy and standards, use layers, right? And start at the bottom with the application and then move up. That enterprise layer should be really, really thin and lightweight. And then lastly, use dependencies when it comes to scaling. So kind of in closing, right? Most important thing, change is possible. And in order to do that change, we really recommend these three keys, which is measure your successes, measure your results, radiate your successes, and slowly evolve the organization. So, you know, when you go back to work next week, I want you to think about those three keys. And, you know, from a measure perspective, try to create a metric for your team. Try to make sure that that metric is aligned to the enterprise objectives or goals, right? Radiate something that you've learned from this session, from this conference, right? Commit something to open source. Write a blog, a white paper. Train somebody on your team with something that you've learned over this process. And from Evolve, take a look at the work that you've already done from automation. What are the upstream inputs and the downstream outputs, right? How can you improve the lives of the people that are on either end of that step in the process that you've already automated? So, with that, I say thank you. I hope you're enjoying the conference. I appreciate your time. And we've got a few minutes left for questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, please raise your hand if you have a question so we can get it on the audio. Sure. Get to the microphone. 1 sec.
So when you talked about metrics and how important they are, and that you want to align your metric with your expected outcome, have you ever seen that backfire where a metric betrays your proving process?
That's a great question, actually. So I've typically tried to create metrics in pairs because there is always the metric to try to get the behavior that you're getting, that you're looking to get, but then there's normally kind of like the anti-pattern to that behavior, and you need to be measuring the metric for that as well. So let's actually make it real, right? So frequent code commits, just because I know I used that one earlier, that's a really great metric. But what if you're checking in junk? Like, what good does that really do? So, adding a metric around, well, how many unit tests did I create to linked to that particular feature that I just checked in? That's a nice way to help start driving quality. Or, before committing it, did it pass unit tests and pre-commit? It's another metric that you can introduce. So, great question. I mean, yes, metrics can absolutely drive the wrong behavior. So feel free to change them if that's what's happening. But do try to think of them in pairs, because you can introduce two metrics that will kind of oppose each other and keep you in the happy path in the middle.
Next question.
So some of these metrics are kind of abstract and getting answers that we want to see. Frequently, executives try to focus on what's the dollar amount associated with that. So how do you try translating that to really dollar amounts if you go down the route of measuring code commits per week?
Right. So I may have glossed over it a bit fast. Right. So the key metric wasn't code commits. The key metric was I want to be able to deploy code to production every 28 days. And I knew that currently it was taking 90 days. And so we were able to figure out what it cost this company to make a deployment in 90 days and what the target was going to be if it were 28 days, right? So now we've already converted everything to money. Those team and individual metrics like code commit or unit tests or do I have configuration code for the feature that I'm just putting out? Those are more behavioral metrics that are just trying to shape how the team works together to kind of create that new story of experience about how to do work that's going to enable you to hit that goal that the executives care about, which is how do I move from 90 days to 28 days? Does that make sense? Because you're right, just like they don't care about server configs, they don't care about code commits either.
Got another question?
So when you talked about going from 98 days to 28 days, let's say there's some overhead and you can only deliver a quarter of the changes that you would normally do in the 90-day window. So you're going backwards, but your metrics say that you're going forward. And so you have that dual metric that now shows, that actual product that you're releasing isn't as good as it was for the 90 days. So how do we, start going down that path and say, that's where we are now, but we can clean up that overhead and make the process better?
So I'm not 100% sure I understand the question. Are you saying, yes, I moved from 90 days to 28 days, but the level of quality that I can deploy in 28 days is better?
Well, let's say you could do 100 features in 90 days, and now you can only do 25 features in 28 days. Your turnover is going to be lower for 3 months. Okay.
Actually, that happened a lot. I remember doing agile rollouts too, when we shifted from 4-week to 3-week to 2-week sprints. You can always baseline on a single number, right? So if, say, I did 100 features in 90 days, but I'm doing 25 features every 2 weeks, I can obviously just multiply my 2 weeks by, six, almost 6, to get to that 90 days, right? So then I can show parity there. If the number ends up being lower, which actually a lot of times it does, because we're actually starting to introduce a lot of other things that are going to slow velocity down, like, chances are when you were at that 90, in fact, I know in this particular instance, at that 90-day window, right, they weren't running the level of tests that we were running. So one of the things that we're also showing, or that we can also show is, yes, our feature velocity has gone down, but our level of quality has gone up. Exactly. There's no one magic metric either. I wish there were.
Okay, any other questions? Everybody's ready for the Wave House, I can tell. Okay. Great, well, let's thank you, Bart.
Yeah, thank you.
Great,
and thank
great
you, everybody.
presentation.